This Saturday on the National Lottery Live, news of one of the largest ever Heritage Awards for Britain's canals, a record £25 million, plus special guests ABC with their new single, and Caprice joining Bob Monkhouse for his last show, and Mystic Meg, tomorrow at the earlier time, 7:45, BBC One.
This is BBC One.
Good morning, and in case you missed it, Labour won. And during this historic day, we're going to be following the events as power is transferred from one party to another with great swiftness and a minimum of ceremony. But we shall be talking to people throughout the country about the result. But above all, we'll be following the party leaders and seeing what they have to say and watching this transfer of power as a new incumbent takes up residence in number 10. So stick with us right through today. And now we join Liz McKean for the news.
Thank you, David. Good morning. John Major and Tony Blair will go to see the Queen this morning. Mr Major to resign as Prime Minister. Mr Blair to take his place after Labour's biggest ever election victory. He'll have an estimated Commons majority of 179. With only a handful of results still to come, Labour have 417 seats. The Conservatives have 160 and the Liberal Democrats 41. In Scotland and Wales, the Conservatives have been wiped out. The SNP have 6 seats and Plaid Cymru 4. The Conservative rout cost several cabinet ministers their seats. Malcolm Rifkind and Malcolm Portillo, Michael Forsyth and Ian Lang, William Waldegrave and Tony Newson were all thrown out. At 3:27 this morning, Mr Major accepted he'd been comprehensively defeated and congratulated Tony Blair on his success. Lance Price reports now on a night that has transformed the country's political landscape.
It was the kind of victory party that in 18 years of opposition, Labour feared they might never see again. A scale of victory that nobody from Tony Blair down believed would be theirs. But theirs it was. As the new Prime Minister-to-be acknowledged the cheers of his supporters, he paid tribute to Neil Kinnock, the man who started the fight back, and to John Smith, whose words he remembered. All we ask is the chance to serve. Tony Blair has been given that chance on a night that means the record book will have to be rewritten.
A new dawn has broken, has it not? And it is wonderful. We always said that if we had the courage to change, then we could do it, and we did it. And let me say this to you. The British people have put their trust in us. It is a moving and it is a humbling experience. And the size of our likely majority now imposes a special sort of responsibility upon us.
If John Major knew he was heading for defeat, he could never have allowed himself to believe it would be defeat on this scale. He'd watched as minister after minister, backbencher after backbencher were swept away by Labour's tidal wave. The scenes at Conservative Central Office this morning could not have been more different from 5 years ago. John Major adopted a sporting metaphor. Sometimes, he said, the ball just rolls away from you.
Tonight we have suffered a very bad defeat. Let us not pretend to ourselves it was anything other than what it was. Unless we accept it for what it was and look at it, we will be less able to put it right. We've lost some very good servants of the party, people who've devoted a huge amount of their life to the service of this country and the service of this party. We've lost, temporarily I hope, some colleagues, both senior and not so senior, who still have a lot of service to give this country and this party and who will, I hope, be back where they should be in the House of Commons, serving us all.
The look on the faces of senior Tory figures marked the defeat of yet another cabinet minister. Labour took many famous scalps, but perhaps the one they celebrated most was that of Michael Portillo. He was planning to run for the party leadership. Now he had to face life out of Parliament altogether.
A truly terrible night for the Conservatives. I would have wished to have been part of rebuilding it inside the House of Commons. I can't now do that, but I would like to do whatever I can from the wings to help rebuild a great party which has a great future.
But a future without the Foreign Secretary, Malcolm Rifkind, the most senior member of the Cabinet to fall. Both he and the Scottish Secretary, Michael Forsyth, were potential candidates for the leadership. Both fell by the wayside as the Conservatives lost every seat they held in Scotland. Wales, too, is now a Tory-free zone. The Conservatives hold no seats outside England. The massive swing to Labour was evident from the outset, but it was Birmingham Edgbaston, the first gain of the night, that confirmed that only the safest of Tory seats were remotely secure. Famous faces were forced into reluctant smiles. David Mellor, former cabinet minister turned media star, fell in Putney, jeered out by the leader of the referendum party.
Is a derisory total.
But while the referendum party fared ill, the Liberal Democrats scored triumph after triumph in their target seats. Paddy Ashdown now leads the strongest third-party force since the 1930s. While he lost some of his old parliamentary team, he gained many more, especially in the southwest, now Liberal Democrat country.
We are the largest force of Liberal Democrats and Liberals that this country has had since the days of Lloyd George. And we will use that force, we will use the vote that people have given us in the next Parliament with a hugely increased number of Liberal Democrat members of Parliament to fight every minute, every second, every hour through the next Parliament for those things that we have campaigned for in this election.
And up in Tatton, the constituency that attracted attention more than any other, the anti-corruption candidate Martin Bell easily defeated the former Minister Neil Hamilton.
I believe you have lit a beacon which will shed light in some dark corners and illuminate the Mother of Parliaments itself. It is a strong signal to the rest of the country which will be heeded.
But it was Tony Blair's night. As he flew down from his Sedgefield constituency to join that party in London, he knew that he was only the third Labour leader to win a Commons majority, the youngest Prime Minister since 1812. He'll start forming his cabinet later today, negotiating in Europe within weeks. But for now, he was savouring a victory of such breathtaking magnitude that the political world is quite literally at his feet.
And our political correspondent, Huw Edwards, is in Downing Street. Huw, what more can you tell us about the timetable for the rest of the day?
Liz, very good morning to you. Lots of us here, lots of journalists, lots of photographers, still trying to take in the magnitude of what happened overnight. The pattern of the morning is now becoming more clear. We've known for a while that John Major will leave Downing Street here at about 11:20 this morning. He will go to the palace, he will see Her Majesty the Queen, offer his resignation, which of course will be accepted at 11:30. That should last anything up to half an hour. We now know, I've had it confirmed in the last few minutes, that Mr. Blair will make his way to the palace by about 12:30. That should mean, on average timings again, that he'll be back here at Downing Street to take up his post as Britain's new Prime Minister, the youngest for almost 200 years, at around lunchtime. 1 o'clock, 1:10. That's the best guess we have at the moment.
Huw, is there any more about Mr. Major's plans? Will he stay on as Conservative leader or will he go?
The consensus seems to be, Liz, at the moment, from those friends of John Major. We heard from Geoffrey Archer on Breakfast News a short while ago. They seem to think that the best plan is for him to stay on a little, to try and hold things together and to pave the way for the succession of a leader who he would consider to be a favourable successor to him. Whether he will succeed in doing that, Liz, I just don't know, simply because the magnitude of the defeat of the Tories may well force his hand. He may not have his way on that.
And what about Mr. Blair, finally, Huw? When will we start to get an idea of who's in his cabinet?
As soon as he arrives here, Liz, he will be in there, he'll meet the staff. He'll meet Sir Robin Butler, the key figure, the Cabinet Secretary, and very soon they will then get down to work. The first task will be to confirm those half a dozen very important top Cabinet posts. We know who they are: Robin Cook, Gordon Brown, Lord Irvin. I could go on, but half a dozen of them. I think we'll have those confirmed by mid-afternoon, perhaps by tea time. The rest will have to wait for later tonight and tomorrow.
Huw Edwards in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed. There's been a shaky start to trading on the financial markets following the unexpectedly large Labour victory. Trading started on the London stock market a short time ago. The FTSE is down marginally at by around 20 points, but the pound has fallen back quite sharply since European trading started. It's down 2 pfennigs against the German mark. Now for the rest of the day's news. A man who killed a total of 4 people has arrived back in Britain after being deported from Australia. Archie McCafferty, who emigrated from Glasgow at the age of 10, was granted parole last month after serving 23 years in jail. But his appeal to be allowed to stay in Australia was rejected. Conditions at the Maze prison near Belfast are expected to return to normal this morning after the end of a protest by loyalist inmates. They took control of 2 blocks at the jail 3 days ago over the introduction of new security measures. The protest was called off after agreement was reached between loyalist politicians and officials from the prison service. The Zairian rebel leader Laurent Kabila is reported to have left his headquarters for talks with President Mobutu of Zaire. The meeting is expected to take place on a South African Navy ship. Earlier this week, the American envoy Bill Richardson won an agreement from both sides for a face-to-face meeting. The European Court of Human Rights will rule today in the case of a man who faces deportation to the West Indies after developing AIDS in a British prison. The man, known as Mr. D, claims he'll receive inadequate health care in his home country. He was jailed for 6 years for drug smuggling. That's it from me. Back now to the election studio and David Dimbleby.
Well, here in the election studio throughout today, we're going to be following the events of this dramatic turn of events. Labour coming in with such a huge majority, the changeover, John Major going to the Palace, Tony Blair going to the Palace, and then coming back to number 10 Downing Street. We'll be out and about round London on this brilliant, sunny, early spring or mid-spring morning, May the 2nd, and there, shimmering in the light, the Thames and the Palace of Westminster and Big Ben, which I think has now restarted after a brief hiatus before the election. And our helicopter will be following the route and going from Downing Street down to Buckingham Palace, and we'll see Tony Blair perhaps leaving his house in Islington, where he may have just had a few moments sleep before getting ready for his big day. Number 10 Downing Street, crowd already assembled there, and John Major expected to leave from there, not for some time yet. And when Mr. Blair gets here, we think he'll come down the street and talk to people before he goes into number 10. You remember Mrs. Thatcher in '79 used the words of the prayer of St. Francis on the steps before she went into number 10, and Mr. Blair will no doubt try and use the moment to say something pithy and significant before he goes in and starts the business of announcing his senior cabinet appointments. He'll be leaving from his house in Islington, where he and his family and children live, and they've still got their Labour poster up for Chris Smith, who won Islington last night. Whether they're going to stay in that house or whether they'll live in the rather cramped quarters of the flat at number 10 Downing Street is not yet quite clear. They're probably in for rather a shock when they see how tiny the accommodation is at number 10. And Buckingham Palace, where the Queen will first of all receive John Major after his years in office and accept his resignation. He arrives in the Prime Minister's car. He leaves the Prime Minister's car there and returns to number 10 in an ordinary government car, and the Prime Minister's car waits there to bring Tony Blair back after he goes to kiss hands, which is not actually any longer kissing hands. That's just the formal expression used for his accepting the Queen's commission. So we'll be talking to the Labour Party about their reactions. In particular, we'll be up at Sedgefield, at Trimdon Labour Club, if they've got any stomach for more talk tonight after an evening of celebration about the nature of the victory that began there in Sedgefield for Tony Blair in 1983, when he unexpectedly won the nomination for the seat. And it's been his base ever since, a nice, safe Labour seat right next to Durham, where he went to school, in the choir school, where he was brought up. And he has many friends there. It is a good, solid base from which to mount his assault on the leadership after the death of John Smith, when he stepped quickly in. In Stevenage, we're going to be at a factory, the Glaxo factory, and there we'll be talking to a cross-section of voters and people working in the factory about what they expect from the new government. It's interesting that this Labour government is coming in. It seems much more on a wave of anti-Tory vote than pro-Labour vote. That's to say, the turnout's down, the actual number of people who vote for Labour, who voted for Labour yesterday or on Thursdays, seems to be less than the number, or fewer than the number, who voted for the Conservatives in the election of 1992. So it's not as though there's some huge positive wave of support for Labour. In fact, the support for the Liberal Democrats perhaps supports this theory as well. So much as a determination to get rid of the Tories. Anyway, we'll be hearing what people say about that. And we'll be down at Conservative Central Office again, if they have the stomach to say very much tonight. They're so shattered, were they, by the sweeping this morning, I should say. I don't know, I seem to have lost my sense of time at the moment. They were so shattered by the events of last night and by the scale of the Tory defeat back to the kind of support they had at the beginning or halfway through the 19th century. Nothing they expected, worse than anything that happened in 1945. So we'll be talking to them and seeing whether they are starting to pick up the pieces. John Major last night made no reference to giving up the leadership of the party, but there may be some discussion about that. We'll also have a look at the story in Scotland, where the Tories have been completely wiped out, and where, if the referendum gets the go-ahead from the people of Scotland, Edinburgh will soon have its parliament, the one that Mr. Blair unflatteringly compared to an English parish council at one point during the campaign, and said won't use the tax-raising powers that it will have. But the debate on all that and all the complex constitutional matters are still to come. But as a result of this election, it looks certain that will happen in Edinburgh. That's the assembly where the Scottish Parliament will be, the old high school on the hill in Edinburgh. And then we'll be looking at Wales, where once again the Tories have been wiped out. The support for an assembly here, we'll be getting the count from Brecon and Radnorshire. The support for an assembly here is rather more muted than in Scotland, according to the latest polls, but that is the big constitutional decision that the people of Wales will face under Labour's plans, a referendum to be held after the referendum has been held in Scotland. This is the #1 Liberal Democrat target, incidentally, a very tight three-way battle, which the Conservatives hold at the moment. And we'll be getting all our results from Northern Ireland this morning, because it doesn't count until today. Here's Belfast City Hall, and work already beginning on the count there, in particular watching to see whether Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, wins the seat held by Joe Hendren at West Belfast in the SDLP, and looking at the other results and hearing analysis of the effect not only of the vote in Northern Ireland, but also of the new government coming in on events in Northern Ireland. We've got some other seats in England that haven't yet been declared. Berwick-on-Tweed, for instance, which is a large constituency and counts late. Alan Beath, the Liberal Democrat deputy leader and Home Affairs spokesman, is there. He has a majority of 5,000 from the last election, with the Conservatives last time round as the #2 challengers. He should be fairly safe there, Labour in third place. And another huge constituency, William Hague's constituency of Richmond in Yorkshire, which stretches from east to west right across Yorkshire, and so doesn't have its count until later on, and we'll be getting that. And we're down in Cornwall at St Ives, where the vote is also being counted even as we speak. Conservative William Rogers has a very small majority there, 1,500. It's a Liberal Democrat challenge, and they have high hopes that they'll get the seat. It's 7th on the Liberal Democrat target list. At the moment, the Liberal Democrats have got 41 seats. They've gained 27, lost 2, and 4 more predicted. 45 they're going to get altogether, we predict, so it should be 44. So those are some of the things we're going to be doing during today. There are 3 interesting recounts going on as well. In Winchester, where they're starting a recount at 2 o'clock, Liberal Democrats hoping to take that seat. Dorset South, where they're starting a recount at 11 o'clock this morning, and that's also a Liberal Democrat hopeful. And Kettering, the last cabinet minister not to know his fate, Roger Freeman, and there's a second recount going on at Kettering, where we'll have news of all those. In the meantime, Peter, let's have a look at the way the battle went.
David, the records have been tumbling all night. It's been quite extraordinary following the pace of them as the voters come piling into the ballot boxes. Here it is rolling in here. The turnout looks like being perhaps the lowest since the war, hence Labour votes piling up there through 6-7 million, perhaps unlikely to reach the total they reached in 1951, the 13, nearly 14 million they had there, nevertheless way ahead of the Tories. What's been so impressive about the opposition parties in this election is the way they've maximised their vote where it's counted, big tactical votes. The Liberal Democrats, therefore, doing very well, although only 17%, as you can see there, in terms of share, nevertheless, huge number of seats because the Labour Party has been supporting them in their target seats. 45% the Labour Party, share of the vote so far, 31%. The Tories, a 14% lead for Labour, biggest lead Labour's ever had in an election-winning situation like this, 17% the Liberal Democrats and 7% the others. The referendum party, incidentally, getting about 750,000 votes. Here's the position, the pattern of the country last time, and just look how it's changed. That great swathe of blue across the south of the country there, the John Major success last time, and now it's changed into this. The results we have in so far, Brecon and Radnorshire there, grey empty space still to come, one or two results still to come in, but nevertheless enough to see the really dramatic way in which Labour have changed the colour of the country, and the Liberal Democrats as well. Flashing the gains there, you'll notice how Wales is completely empty of blue at all. So is Scotland. No Tory MPs in Scotland and Wales for the first time in history. The Liberal Democrats coming powerfully in along the south coast here, taking something like half their target seats, and they're going to have twice the representation in the House of Commons that they had before. The swing gets greater as you go down the country. Here we have it in Scotland, 7% to Labour, 10%, 7% in Wales. But as you come down to where those precious Tory marginals are, so the swing has built up. And in London, the Tories are going to have 11 MPs. Quite extraordinary. 74 MPs altogether, only 11 of them Conservatives in the new Parliament. Now, here is a sort of measure of Labour's success. The 96 targets they had from the Tory party, standing there in blue blocks. The higher the block, Portsmouth North here, the more comfortably the Tories were placed last time. The lower the block, Vale of Glamorgan down here, the more easy for Labour to gain. 3 Liberal Democrat targets for Labour and Ceredigion over there. So let's just fly around now and see how effective Labour's attack on these targets has been. Watch the little hit box here and the miss box here and see how many of these they hit. They only needed half of them for an overall majority. Here we go, starting with Falmouth and Camborne along the south coast. Portsmouth North coming up. Watch what happens in London. I can't see Simon Hughes has sort of disappeared. A great, huge pile of tower blocks surrounding Simon Hughes. Here we go, Vale of Glamorgan now, a huge Labour majority. Up through the Midlands, Yorkshire, going up to Scotland, heading to Scotland now. That small tile there is Michael Forsyth's seat, Stirling. It's now a huge Labour majority. So there's the position in those Labour target seats. As you can see, with a single exception of Ceredigion, where Plaid Cymru has survived, and Simon Hughes is somewhere down in the middle of all this, 98 hits and 2 misses. A very, very effective performance by Labour in its target seats. Into the Commons to see then the shape of the new chamber. Over on the right-hand side here, the opposition benches, John Major with the fewest Conservative MPs we've seen since 1906, only 10 fewer then. Paddy Ashdown with twice the number of MPs he had before, the most since Lloyd George in 1931, 29 the others, the Nationalists and Northern Ireland and so on, the Unionists, 330 the Labour Party needs for an overall majority, and here they come rattling along the government benches now through the winning post. They're going to have to go around the other side of the House with some of their MPs. There won't be any room for them. 419, Labour's never had be above 400 MPs before. Subtract one from the other, and you get a Labour majority of 179, and here we have the Conservative vote now, another contrasting record breaker. That's the Duke of Wellington back in 1832, in the disastrous election the Tories had just after the Great Reform Act. They got 29% then. There's Ted Heath with 36.7%, the worst Tory this century, the worst Tory percentage of the vote this century. And here now is John Major with 31.4% this time. Not quite as bad as the poor old Duke of Wellington, but a lot worse than Ted Heath, David.
Simon Hughes, who you had buried under the rubble, won, didn't he, with the
majority
majority
he did win.
of 3,000 or so.
I was trying to say that, yes, but
yes.
He's got a smaller majority, and he's lost, of course, among all these Labour MPs around him.
But he got a majority, but he did it by wearing a red rose during the campaign, so he persuaded people to vote for him as well as to vote for him if they wanted to vote Labour. He was very much chased by Labour. Let's go to Northern Ireland now, because there's an interesting story of which last night, of course, in the great rush of British results, we didn't hear. I didn't hear about. Dennis Murray is in Belfast. And Dennis, just tell us what the story is in Northern Ireland and what we should be looking out for during this morning.
Well, the story, I think, is, as it has been really since 1983, when Sinn Féin first became a real electoral force in Northern Ireland. They've a reasonable chance of getting maybe up to 3 seats at this election. Gerry Adams, as you mentioned earlier, is hoping to take his West Belfast seat back from Dr. Joe Hendren of the SDLP, the main nationalist party, although we were hearing from the constituency last night that a lot of unionists who live in the Shankill part of West Belfast were voting tactically in favour of Joe Hendren for the SDLP. They might also win Mid-Ulster, although the sitting MP there, William McCrea, the DUP, is quietly confident that he'll retain it. But the one really interesting seat, I think, is in West Tyrone, which is a new seat here in Northern Ireland, and all the parties say it's just too close to call. That's a three-way fight between Sinn Féin, the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists.
And insofar as Sinn Féin pick up seats, is their policy still not to swear the oath of allegiance and come to Westminster?
That's absolutely right. It's actually part of their constitution. They are an abstentionist party. They changed that some years ago, 1986 I think it was, to take seats in the Irish Parliament in the Dáil, but I think that would be a jump way too far for Sinn Féin. It takes a majority vote of the party conference and they need a two-thirds majority. They are duty-bound to be abstentionist MPs.
And Dennis, do you expect any difference of nuance at all in the handling of Northern Irish affairs from the incoming government?
I think there's bound to be some difference, not least, and I mean, I know this is superficial, but let's not discount the superficial. Mo Mowlam, whom we all expect to become the Secretary of State, she will be the first woman Secretary of State in Northern Ireland. I was listening to Monica McWilliams this morning of the Women's Coalition Party here, and she said that their two representatives at the multi-party talks are the only two women who consistently sit in that room. So that, for a start, will be a sea change. One thing, though, is that Mo Mowlam said consistently for ages, she's put down several markers that the conditions for Sinn Féin to come into those talks will remain the same as those set down by John Major, which are nobody will talk to them. No government minister, party member will talk to Sinn Féin unless there's a new IRA ceasefire.
Dennis Murray, thank you very much indeed. We'll be having those results as soon as they come through, of course, from Northern Ireland. Now, Jeremy, good morning.
Good morning, David. I have with me Kenneth Baker, Shirley Williams and Roy Hattersley. Kenneth Baker, speaking as a former chairman of the party, we are presumably, all things being equal, looking at a two-term Labour government here, aren't we?
That is possible. I think the first thing one's got to do is, when you've lost as badly as we have lost, and we're bleeding, is to stop the flow of blood. So bind up the wounds and stop inflicting any more wounds upon oneself. And that will take a bit of time. But the Conservative Party is a very resilient body and a being. And it's a great party, and it is not going to disappear any more than the Labour Party disappeared in '83.
I was going to talk about the Labour Party, but you raised the subject of your own private grief. Presumably that means then no early leadership challenge.
I would hope not. I think
so
that
what
the leadership
wait till
matter,
the autumn?
I would have thought that would be my advice if I were asked. But it's very much a personal matter for John Major. He may feel that he's just borne heat and burden too long. I hope that he'll go on for a little while, because I think the party does need a time for reflection and consideration.
Right. Shirley Williams, what's it like when you come in and you're confronted with possibility of ministerial office, and suddenly you see all these books you've never seen before, you meet all these civil servants who are probably trying to run you rather than you run them? These guys are in for quite a culture shock, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I remember confronting when I first became a cabinet minister was those famous books which tell you exactly what your policies are, what they're going to cost and why you probably can't bring them off, and also tell you that the huge financial implications of what you want to do. I think one of the problems with Labour is that it has a very vague mandate. It's a very big majority, but a very vague mandate. And so in some ways that actually creates greater difficulties in terms of getting the civil servants to understand what your priorities are. And Labour, I think, has put most of its energy into rebuilding the party, and one has to hand it to Blair. He's done that brilliantly. But I doubt whether they've thought very much at all about what they're going to do now they've got the power.
Roy Hattersley, you wrote recently, Thursday, May the 1st, will be a day of jubilation, but after the celebration there will be serious questions to be raised about the distribution of milk and honey. You still think that?
That was an image from entering the promised land, yes, and where we are rather firmly today. Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of work to be done over the next few months about the future of the government and how the government spends its money, not so much spends its time. But I think the government will go very slowly. Kenneth Baker was right to say that the Labour Party didn't disappear after '83, but it very nearly did. and it rebuilt itself and recreated itself in a rather different image after 83. And while all that's going on, which is bound on the Tory party, in a sense the government will have a free run. And my guess is that Tony Blair will be very cautious, take things very slowly, and insist on reminding the country that he said don't expect too much too soon. He'll want to underachieve rather than a big dash, 100 days, and then it all fall away afterwards.
But I think he's going to be very busy. Just on the constitutional stuff, we're going to have 2 referendum bills very quickly. There'll be referendums this autumn. There'll be big constitutional changes. And we are all of a sufficient age to know how difficult that happens to get, even with a big majority, to get things through. But I think the real difficulty for Tony Blair, and I think this is a Tony Blair personal victory, it's a tremendous credit. He's taken the Labour Party and made it what he, in his image, and when you were asking Shirley Williams what it's like to be a minister, about 7 o'clock tonight he'll probably open his first red box, and he will see the briefs from the Cabinet Secretary, and he will then begin to realise how difficult it is to run our country and how to meet all those expectations that have been raised during the election.
And can I bring on another thing which really worries me very much about the problems facing the new government? He's put himself in a box already because of committing himself to the Conservative budget constraints. Yet he spoke in the last couple of days in very glowing and promised land terms about the health service, education and so on. How on earth he gets out of the box where he's thrown the key away, I do not know. That seems to me to be the most difficult single problem that he faces.
He can't, can he?
Well, I don't think anyone will want him to, even though there are those who said that we'd like to see more spending from the government and, if necessary, increasing taxes to meet it. Don't expect and wouldn't want the government to get in and say, well, we made all those promises a month ago, but we're not going to keep them. The problem, I think, is if Gordon Brown gets to the Treasury today, having committed himself to stick to Tory spending limits, and discovers that the Tory party weren't going to stick to their own spending limits, not for reasons of investing in social services, but because the economy, particularly the national debt, is in such a condition that they were planning a big tax increase after the election.
Even if that isn't the case, isn't this government carrying such a fantastic burden of expectations now that they simply can't be reconciled with the very strict promises
first of
made in the
all,
manifesto?
enormous credit to Tony Blair that he's tried to dampen down the expectations. As I said, there's been no promises of 100 days of dynamic action. He hasn't promised what the governments in which Shirley and I remember promised to do, straight in, big increases in social security payments and so on. None of those specific promises have been in the programme. But I guess, because of the nature of Tony, that's being young, looking full of hope, looking as if he is about the future, there are expectations building up which he hasn't himself encouraged, and that's his problem.
Well,
the
not
idea,
entirely
not
fair.
the fact.
No, I mean, there's been a lot of implicit promise, let's be honest, in what he said about the National Health Service and education. That's an implicit promise. I don't see how he can keep it.
And you don't actually decrease hospital waiting lists by hope or improve educational standards by declaration.
We'll kick this around a little more in a moment. David.
Thanks, Jeremy. We'll have our reporters out following Tony Blair as he goes to the palace and leaves Islington. Let's just see what they have to tell us at the moment. Jeremy Vine, Jenny Bond and Huw Edwards. Jeremy Vine, first of all.
David, thank you very much. Yes, as you've already said, Tony Blair and Cherie and their 3 children are at home behind me here. And we think at about 11:30 they will go in what has been the Labour leader's car for a while to the palace, and then he'll leave that in a ministerial car because he will then be the Prime Minister. I imagine they're still taking in the shock of the sheer scale of this victory for him, because all the way through the election campaign, when I was with him on the battle bus along with all those other journalists and we said, look at the polls, you're going to win by over 100 seats, he would simply say, no way, they're out of line with the reality. Well, as it turned out, the reality was on an even grander scale. And of course, a lot will focus on what Mr. Blair says when he gets into Downing Street as well. And I was just reminded there, as you mentioned, Mrs. Thatcher in 1979, who quoted that prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, saying, where there is discord, may we bring unity. Well, I wonder whether Mr. Blair might not echo that, given that overnight he's been talking about one nation and bringing the country together. He's got some authority to say that now, of course, because of this huge victory that he's won across the country.
Thanks very much. And Jenny Bond, what happens at the palace today?
Well, we're expecting Mr. Major here in just under 2 hours. At 11:30, he'll go through these gates for the last time as Prime Minister. He'll drive through to the inner quadrangle and go through the King's Door, where he'll be met, I understand, by the Queen's Private Secretary, Sir Robert Fellows. And then he'll go upstairs to the audience room. It's a room on the first floor, a very comfortable room overlooking the gardens, and one with which, of course, Mr. Major will be very familiar. It's where he's met the Queen for the past 6 years, every Tuesday evening for his audiences. There's no set pattern of words for what will happen in there. There are no seals of office, for example, for the Prime Minister, nothing to hand over. But verbally, he will offer his resignation, and of course, the Queen will accept it. Obviously, one would expect then they'll have a bit of a chat, and he will leave then, not, of course, back to Downing Street, one presumes possibly to his home in Huntingdon. And after what is deemed a decent interval, probably about 20 minutes, probably at about 12:30, Mr. Blair will arrive. It's thought he may well bring his family with him. He will follow the same path up to the audience room, be taken in there, and will be alone with the Queen. Again, no set formal pattern of words. The Queen, though, will ask him to form the next government. He, I'm sure, will agree. And it's called a kissing hands audience, but there is no kissing of hands on this occasion. That happens at the Privy Council meeting, which will take place perhaps over the weekend. What I'm told they will do is have a very firm, I'm sure, shake of the hand and perhaps a talk about the future. And then he will leave back to Downing Street.
But Jenny, does the Queen actually say to John Major, I accept your resignation, and then say to Mr. Blair, I offer you my commission as Prime Minister?
She can say whatever she wants, David.
I mean, there aren't any formal words even to this. It's just a kind of bumping into each other at the palace.
Something like that. Yes, we're told it is as informal as the Queen would wish to make it, and they say things are quite informal here at the palace. We shall never know what is said. These meetings between the Prime Minister and the Sovereign are, by their very nature, always confidential. He'll be the 10th Prime Minister that the Queen will have appointed in her reign, the 3rd Labour Prime Minister, and she's known to have got on really rather well with his two predecessors, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Callaghan.
Well, the last Labour Prime Minister to win an election did take his whole family there, Harold Wilson, so we shall see whether Tony Blair follows suit. Thanks very much, Jenny. And now Downing Street and Huw Edwards. Now, what's the serious business of government going to be today?
Well, David, the timetable is now clear. Tony Blair, Britain's youngest Prime Minister for almost 200 years, will arrive here at around lunchtime, by which I mean 1 o'clock, around 1:10. It'll be a special arrival. He won't drive all the way up in the car, I'm told. He will get out and walk up Downing Street. There'll be some supporters in Downing Street here. You can sense the atmosphere that that will create. In the meantime, John Major is inside. Came back at about 6:30 this morning. He freshened up a little, had some breakfast. I'm told that so far he's not had any sleep. He's far too busy saying his farewells to lots of people in there, and the process of preparing for Mr. Major's departure well underway. Let me show you, David, one graphic illustration of that. Behind us in Horse Guards Parade, there is a removal van.
He's going abroad, is he?
He's
leaving the country.
David. It says overseas. That is rather ominous. I'm told I'm not to read anything into that. Overseas in this case means Huntingdon for the time being. And an incredible scene there, all the stuff being loaded up at the back. Different to some of the occasions in the past when that removal van or a similar van has actually not gone round to Horse Guards Parade at the back there. It's actually been here in Downing Street. Back in 1974, for example, Ted Heath moved out with the removal van in Downing Street itself. This one is at the back. It's already started, David. It'll take a few days, I think, to unload all of Mr. Major's stuff out of Downing Street into those vans, because of course there's 6.5 years of material, of papers, of belongings to take out.
Huw, is there any government business to be conducted before he leaves number 10?
I don't think so, David, frankly. Everything's sort of on hold for the simple reason that any big decisions pending now will in any case have been shared with Mr. Blair. He got lots of briefings yesterday. He's been in touch with the Cabinet Secretary at a very close level for some days, in fact, for some weeks, in fact. So that process, the seamless robe of government that Whitehall likes to talk about, is there to be seen. Mr. Blair has already been woven into the system. Mr. Major's been carefully woven out. So by the time Mr. Blair arrives here, by the time he has that important meeting with Sir Robin Butler, the Cabinet Secretary, at around 1:30 today, when he's been greeted and taken inside and met the staff, he will know basically what decisions there are to be taken that come back from Mr. Major's time, from Mr. Major's past few weeks, and of course he will then get down to the process of writing on a piece of paper who he wants in which job.
Okay, Huw, thanks very much indeed. And now John Sopel at the Tory party headquarters in Smith Square. John, good morning. I gather you've got some news about what's the Tory party, how the Tory party is reacting and what they're deciding.
Well, David, the scene here at Central Office is a scene of stunning inactivity. You compare it to the past few weeks where the comings and goings have been frantic, and the night when it was all so busy here, and it's as if the place has shut down for the night. Brian Mulwiney's come back. He's apparently tidying his desk and sorting a few bits and pieces out, and then he's planning to disappear for the weekend. And sort of, I think there's just a skeleton staff there at Central Office. The one thing that is interesting, and I think probably noteworthy, is that in the London Evening Standard, we understand that John Redwood is writing an article, and it will be fascinating to see what he's got to say on the big questions, on the future of the Conservative Party, and of course, the even bigger question, the Conservative Party leadership. And we understand he's writing that now and will be in the paper later today.
And of course he's appearing on television over the weekend, isn't he?
Yes, I mean he's
presumably he's rather stymied until John Major shows his hand.
Yes, and I would suspect from having travelled with the Prime Minister these past few weeks that the Prime Minister will be trying to do everything in his power to ensure that John Redwood isn't by default the inheritor of the Tory crown.
Well, you know the Tory party well. What would you do if you wanted to inherit the Tory crown? Supposing you were in John Redwood's shoes, what would you do?
Well, I think what he would be trying to do is obviously building alliances. He'll be trying to reach out to the sort of people who supported him in his failed leadership bid a couple of years back. He will be trying to move carefully. He won't want to be precipitate, because I think then it will look like it is almost unseemly haste with which he wants to grab hold of the Tory party leadership.
But presumably they're all checking with each other's friends all the time, ever since last night, presumably,
exactly.
and trying to get
and
support.
all those shots we saw during the night of John Redwood clutching his mobile phone, talking to this one and that one, I bet you he wasn't talking to constituency party workers in Wokingham. I bet you those calls were going further afield around the country.
OK, John, thank you very much indeed. Jeremy.
David, well, I'm joined now by Peter Mandelson's Labour campaign strategist. Mr. Mandelson, I don't know whether you had a chance to see the pictures we were just watching a moment or two ago of removal vans at the back entrance to Downing Street. But I wonder what you... Here they are. If you have a look at the monitor now, you should be able to see them.
I think I can imagine them, Jeremy.
What does it make you feel?
I feel slightly sorry for Mr. Major. I think he has exited office in quite a dignified way. I thought he made a very good speech at his own declaration in Huntington last night. And I think that considering what his party have done to him, basically spent the last 6 weeks, if not the last 3 years, hacking him to pieces, I think he's emerged with a very stoic and a very dignified way from what has been a personal calamity for him.
What sort of state is Mr. Blair in this morning?
Sober, I would say. Very sober, very
Just as
serious.
well, I suppose.
I don't mean, I mean sober in the thoughtful sense. I think what's bearing in on him are the great responsibilities that have been placed on him as a result of the election. And I think that he is now quickly focusing on his government, the composition of the government, the early briefing papers and early decisions that he's got to address, and the key decisions that he's got to focus on in the preparation for the Queen's speech.
Well, credit where credit's due. This is a most remarkable victory, but even you, in your wildest dreams, can't have imagined this, can you?
And I'm not given to wild dreams, as you know.
What sort of majority were you hoping for?
Jeremy, it's a very difficult question to answer after what's happened. I speculated privately that we were probably heading for a majority of around 50, quite honestly, and that's what I said. I think that was the figure I entered on the Millbank Tower sweepstake some time ago. I can barely remember it a couple of days ago. I didn't expect this, but I now understand what's happened. I think it's not simply that so many people in the country have just so tired of the Conservatives and turned their back on the drift and the divisions and the dogma of the Conservative Party, but something more fundamental has happened than that. And it can be summed up in 2 words: New Labour. I think that if people had had the chance to vote for New Labour in 1992, they would have done, but they didn't. They have had this time, which is why they've placed so much trust and confidence in Tony Blair and his party now.
Are you saying that Neil Kinnock couldn't have achieved this victory?
I'm saying that what Neil Kinnock did from the time he was leader in 1983 was bring victory closer and closer for the Labour Party. What he did...
Let's look forward now, as opposed to looking back to the campaign.
Right.
Tony Blair
You
has
asked the question.
I did. It was a mistake.
Tony Blair talks about... First, Jeremy, I'm very, very proud of having notched up my first admission from you.
Okay, forget the smarminess now. Just to get on with the next question. Get on with the next question, which is this: Tony Blair has talked about a new politics. He's got fantastic room for manoeuvre now with this majority. What sort of politics is he talking about?
I think what he's talking about is this: we've built our electoral success this week on a very broad coalition of support and opinion which stretches across the country, across classes and across professions. And he is determined not to do anything in government that would jeopardize our ability to maintain that coalition and to continue governing from the centre ground of British politics. Now, I think that means governing with a sense of pluralism, observing the fact in government, as he has done to date. He wants to lead a government that is inclusive, that stretches beyond the immediate ranks of the committed in the Labour Party to others in other parties and to no party at all, in order to mobilise, bring the country together and mobilise the broadest possible alliance of people to bring them into and tie them into the programme on which he is now embarking. And I think that's very important to him, and I think it's very important for the country.
With respect, that sounds a bit like what Roy Hattersley described. He's here, he may wish to speak for himself in his review, your book on Blair's Revolution, as replacing ideology with banalities. I mean, what does it actually mean?
Well, what it means is this: that the Labour Party, for a long time in the 1980s, and the late 1970s too, rather closed ranks, became rather inward-looking. Its base shrunk in the country as its membership dwindled and the structures of the Labour Party decayed. Now, what we've seen over the last few years in particular, but it was a process that was started by Neil Kinnock, is a reversal, an opening up of the Labour Party, an opening out of our structures, our membership, the ways in which we do business, the way in which we construct our policies and taking our decisions to a much broader breadth and wealth of people who are now, of course, in their hundreds of thousands, actually joining the Labour Party, as well as associating, and of course in the last 24 hours, voting for the new Labour Party.
Would that approach be inclusive enough to involve the Liberal Democrats, for example, in some sort of relationship in government?
Well, I don't know. It's very early to speculate about that. But as you know, he's always set a great store by the dialogue that we have had and created with the Liberal Democrats. There's been exchange of ideas about policy, and I think that's healthy. I mean, we're not a sectarian party.
Well, if you're not a sectarian party, presumably there would be room for Liberal Democrats to play a part in your government.
Well, in some of people's opinion, it may be. I don't know. I think it's very, very premature to start speculating about that. If you're asking me, whether I think that, Tony Blair's going to race off and start recruiting Liberal Democrats to his government, I would say I think probably not, no. But I mean, let's forget the sort of formalities and discuss the principles and the values that underpin his approach. It is an inclusive one. He wants to continue this process on which New Labour has embarked, of opening our doors to people from other parties and no party to sign up to our crusade, our vision of a new Britain, and the help that we need from people from all quarters, not just particular groups or sectional interests in our community, but from people right across, to help make a reality the very important, very challenging and radical programme that we have adopted, which the people have now voted for, and which we are going to deliver during the course of the coming government.
Peter Mandelson, thanks very much.
Thank you.
David?
I'm joined here by Professor Anthony King, Professor of Politics at Essex University, who was here last night, and Anthony Howard of The Times. Anthony, you heard Peter Mandelson say what the country discovered was New Labour. Was it that, or did they just turn their back on old Tory?
I think they turned their back on old Tory. And I think really, wonderful night last night, A Night to Remember. It was the title of a book by Walter Lord, and it was about the sinking of the Titanic. And I think that's what we saw last night. We saw the Titanic go down, and that was the Tory party.
And what do you conclude from that for Tony Blair? We've heard some doubts expressed with Jeremy's guests about whether Tony Blair has enough of an agenda to push through with a huge majority, possibly with two parliaments. There'll be people wrangling. Heard Peter Mandelson talking about the possibility of some sort of arrangement with other parties. I'm not quite sure what he was getting at.
Nor am I. I think the great disadvantage that Tony Blair has is that a phrase comes back to me that Dick Crossman always used. He said the manifesto was a battering ram for change. And that's what you use to get change done. From the civil servants, for example. You say, I'm sorry, it's in the manifesto, it's got to go that way. And if they said it can't be done, you just say, I'm sorry, that's what the people voted on. You could also use it as a shield if you were a cabinet minister, saying, look, Prime Minister, we did have that commitment. We've got to do something about it. There's none of that there for Blair. So I think he is sort of working from a agenda that doesn't really exist in terms of detailed policy commitments.
But I mean, the civil servants would like nothing more than for you to go in and say, here is our proposal, we don't want to do very much. They'll say, oh, that's very nice, but it's still very sensible of you.
Yes, Humphrey will be a very happy boy this morning, very happy boy indeed.
Tony King, do you agree it's not New Labour that's won, it's old Tories that have lost?
No, I don't really. There's the old saying that governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them. I think only half of that is true. Certainly the Conservatives have governed in such a way over the last 5 years as to make their defeat highly probable, but it doesn't seem to me at all plausible to argue that Labour would have won anything like this kind of majority unless the Labour Party had fundamentally changed and been seen to change. There have been two big changes, one on each side of the British system. You add the two up together, and this is the result you get.
But Tony King, you're a great one for talking about the legitimacy of a government in terms of its popular support, as well as the number of votes, the number of seats it has in the House of Commons. What do you make of the popular vote for Labour, which does look as if it's going to come out at lower than the Tories got at the last election?
Well, it's going to come out at around the mid-40s. It probably will come out rather higher than the Tories got at the last election.
You're speaking percentages. I'm speaking actual numbers.
Oh, in actual numbers. Yes, it is true that the turnout...
14 million odd, nearly 15 million people bothered to go and vote for the Conservatives at the last election. It looks at the moment as though something like 13.5 million will have bothered to go and vote for Labour.
Well, the fact that turnout was low certainly suggests, and I think rightly suggests, that there was no enormous enthusiasm for new Labour out there. But there was clearly a willingness on the part of very large numbers of people to vote for the Labour Party who had not voted for it in the past. And moreover, it's very important to notice that the Conservatives were not able to use their old claim, don't vote for the Liberal Democrats or the Alliance or the Liberals, whoever, because you will let Labour in. In this election, large numbers of people were prepared to do precisely that, to vote tactically for the Liberal Democrats in order to get a Labour government into 10 Downing Street. In other words, the Labour total really has to have added to it most of the Lib Dem total in terms of the number of people who actually wanted a change of government and didn't mind Tony Blair at number 10.
Do you agree with that very briefly?
I don't agree with that. No, I think that that's, you know, it's nice for us to say it from that point of view, but I don't think it's true. I think that the Lib Dems, you know, are a separate party, and you could just as well play those sums in other elections, so why play it this time?
Okay. Well, I could give you some evidence on that point, which is quite simply that when voters were asked by the polls during the election, Liberal Democrat supporters were asked if they had to choose between Conservatives and Labour, who would they choose? They overwhelmingly chose Labour.
Okay. Let's have a look at the results in Scotland, I think, Peter, yes?
Yes, indeed, David, and the most notable thing about this extraordinary record-breaking election, the way the Tories have been wiped out completely in Wales and Scotland. The scrap, of course, has been going on all over England between the Tories and Labour, but there's nothing else to scrap about in Scotland. It's simply gone all the wrong colour for the Tories. Here's the Scottish National Party now with not just 3 seats, Moray, Benford, and Angus, that they had before, but also Tayside North, Perth, and Galloway in Lang's, the President of the Board of Trade seat, which is now, he'll be soon be very former President of the Board of Trade down here in Galloway. With the SNP up 3 seats, as you can see up the top there, Labour on 56. Labour had 50 seats in Scotland before, never beyond 50. Here they have now 56 of the 72 seats in Scotland. So here we have the picture, the final picture, with just Argyll filling in there for the Liberal Democrats. They're hanging on to Argyll, we reckon, at the end of the day, although the Scottish National Party were after that one as well. 46% Labour, 22% the SNP, the share of the vote, 17% the Conservatives, never been this low before in Scotland, 13% the Liberal Democrats. And when you compare that with Scotland as it was before, you see Labour up 6.6, already most of the vote in Scotland. Another 6% is incredible on top of that. The Scottish National Party up a tiny bit. It's because the Tories are down so much that the Scottish National Party are gaining seats off the Tories and the Liberal Democrats much the same as they were before. Now just have a look at the Scottish National Party's targets. Here they are. They were very much seats that the Labour Party held before. But the trouble with the Scottish National Party's position is that the Labour Party targets they have are really quite comfortably Labour. And of course, Labour winning this election by miles, not a hope of winning any of those targets. Liberal Democrat Party targets for the Scottish National Party, Inverness always a possibility, but the really exciting ones for them, of course, were the three that they've ended up gaining successfully, those three targets there, which have now, of course, gone: Scottish National Party, Galloway, Perth, and Tayside North. David.
Thanks very much, Peter. And listening to that, in Edinburgh, Alex Salmond with John Nicholson. John.
Alex Salmond, you fought a very cautious campaign this time round. There's no repeat of the free in 93 kind of claims we saw last time. I mean, are you pleased with the result? You're only up 0.5% or so.
Well, I'm delighted. I mean, not only have we put up our share of the vote, and under the circumstances of a strong move to Labour, but also we've doubled our parliamentary representation. So we fought an all or something campaign. We've come out with something, and I'm pretty pleased with that, yeah.
Now, we're standing here in the Scottish Parliament building, as it will be if Labour gets its legislation through. You must surely at this stage now support the Labour Party devolution legislation. You can't stand back and say that you're not going to back Labour when it's trying to implement a Scottish Parliament.
Oh, I'm prepared to support a Scottish Parliament. What I'm not prepared to support is an English parish council. And to answer the question, we've got to know where sovereignty, where power lies. Is it going to belong to this body, as was promised in the Claim of Right signed by the Labour and Liberal parties? Or is it going to belong to Tony Blair and other English MPs, and that's the way it will stay, as said by the new Prime Minister during the general election campaign? Now, that will be clarified when we see a white paper. When we see a white paper, then we'll make a decision.
Well, I was going to say, that's the question. I mean, what's the answer? I mean, presumably, if the legislation isn't exactly as you would like, if, for example, you don't get a question on independence in the referendum, are you seriously saying that you could be in a position where you would vote against a Scottish Parliament?
No, we've already made it clear that we wouldn't obstruct devolution, therefore we wouldn't be voting against under any circumstances. But the question of the white paper is very important. I mean, I think the change in position of devolution during this election campaign underlines the wisdom of not committing yourself to something in advance. I'm not going to sign a blank cheque. I wouldn't sign it during the election campaign. I won't sign it now. On the question of whether independence should be on a devolution referendum, then I think it is very, very important that that happens, because up to 80% of people in Scotland believe that if we're having a consultative referendum on the future of our nation, then surely independence, along with devolution and the status quo, should be available for the people to choose.
Now, the SNP have made great play during the course of the election about whether or not Labour can be trusted on the devolution question. With such a huge majority, it seems inconceivable that Labour couldn't force through devolution. I mean, there's no worries anymore, surely, about North of England Labour MPs having wobbles in devolution. I mean, it will get onto the statute book. I mean, what sort of difference do you think it will make to Scotland?
Well, I was never worried about North of England MPs. I was worried about one MP from Sedgefield, and I'm still worried about the commitment that the new Prime Minister has to the issue in the Scottish Constitution. I don't think anybody in their right mind in Scotland, after the behaviour and performance in the election campaign, would trust Tony Blair on the issue of Scotland. Now, we're going to have to wait and see. We'll see a white paper, and then we'll take a decision in the best interests of Scotland.
Alex Salmond, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
John Nicholson in Edinburgh. And now we go to Sedgefield and join Fiona Bruce there. Fiona.
David, good morning. Very different scene here this morning from last night. Last night, the streets were heaving. This morning, it's like a ghost town. I think everyone's tucked up in bed. We've got three hardy souls here who haven't been to bed at all, I don't think. I'm joined by Terry Ward, Frank Robson, Mary Smith. Now, Terry Ward, you were at the original meeting when you selected Tony Blair back in 1983. You were watching a football match at the time, I think, so you weren't too impressed by his interrupting that.
Well, he didn't, because he was told not to, so he sat quiet with a glass of wine, and then when the game was over, then we got down to business.
And what did you make of him?
Well, first of all, he looked like one of these guys that can walk into a room and there's a bit of a presence there, but he was so nice and totally honest in my view. That's how I found him.
Did you think, could you have dreamt you were watching the future Prime Minister?
Well, not the Prime Minister, obviously we couldn't say that far forward, but what we did know is we were talking to somebody special, and that was very important, because we nominated him, of course, and the constituency management meeting needed to listen to him, and then the rest is history.
Now, Frank Robson, of course, is a very different story for you, because you stood against him.
That's correct, yes.
What do you make of it now?
Absolutely wonderful.
What has happened has confirmed everything that people thought in those days.
Yeah.
My own wife, who was a member of the General Committee when the selection was made, told me on the way back in the car that he was so young and youthful and energetic, he made the rest of us look old and dowdy. And she went on to say, he will be the Prime Minister of this country.
Now, Mary Smith, you're famous here in the Trinidad Village because your house is decked out with Blair memorabilia and
Yes,
posters in the windows.
Yes, it is.
What kind of Prime Minister do you think he's going to make?
I think he'll make a wonderful Prime Minister. Yes, he will. He will.
Were you surprised by last night? By the size of the majority?
Yes, a little surprised, but I knew he would make it. I knew he would make it.
What kind of man do you think he is? You've met him here. You've met him several times.
I have, yes. He's a good man. And he'll carry out the promises he's made. He'll have to have time, but he'll do it. And the promises he's made are good ones, and they are needed. They really needed these promises.
Now, all we see, Tony Blair, obviously, is a politician on television, but you know him here.
As a friend,
he's well
yes,
known here.
yes.
What kind of man is he?
He's a very sociable man, friendly man. He'll have a chat with you. You know, he just doesn't pass you by.
How often do you get to see him up here?
Well, we've seen a lot more of him recently, you know, but not this last 6 weeks. But in the time gone by, since this was made a Labour club more so, we've seen quite a lot of him.
Well, who knows? You may be seeing less or more.
I know, yeah.
Mary Smith, Frank Ronson and Tory Ward, we'll let you go to bed. I think you've been up all night. You deserve it. Thanks very much,
Thanks
David.
very much.
Peter, one of the interesting things about this election, Tony Howard was referring to it just there, is whether this is an anti-Tory vote. The evidence for that would be if people had been voting across the country not only to get Labour in or to get seats for the Liberal Democrats, but simply to get the Tories out and using their vote, as Paddy Ashdown said, effectively to do that. Has that been happening on a big scale?
Oh, never in a British general election have we seen tactical voting on this scale, and the results have been quite spectacular.